This is the second part of an interview that is being conducted on the 25th of January 2024. And you're going to prompt me, and I'm going to get going again.
Indeed. Hugh Williams, you've told us something of your background, your career, your journey in faith, and indeed in politics. So let's go back to the 1980s. You were living on your farm in Dartmoor, running your very successful accountancy firm and educating your children. How, in the midst of all of that activity, came St. Edward's Press into being?
Well, as they say, I'm very happy you asked me that question, delighted you asked that question, because I was received into the Catholic Church in 1983, and in part one I described the position that I've taken, a very isolated position in which a number of others also find themselves. And we were practicing our faith in morning and evening prayers and rosary and Sunday worship and all that sort of thing, all done at home. And I was getting frustrated by the fact that I kept missing the feasts of the British saints. The days would go by, particularly St. Thomas More. I'd find, I missed that. I wish I had a system which had a calendar that Catholic holy calendar that helped me keep a track of these saints. Of course, one knew from the Missal all the other saints' days and everything, and holy days of obligation. But as I say, I was getting increasingly frustrated about missing the British saints' days. And I think, well, if you haven't if the job hasn't been done, you probably better do the job yourself. And so I started to compile my own calendar using an Excel spreadsheet. And I've actually got it as, I think, probably my only prop today, that here is what I created, the British Calendar of Saints. And as I was drawing to a close, I realized that I shouldn't call it the Hugh Williams calendar, although a name would have to be on it somewhere, because that would turn me into some sort of guru, and that's the last thing I am. I have no authority whatsoever. What I've got here is purely a private publication. And it was, the date was the 13th of October when I asked myself, I wonder whose saint it is today, because maybe we might name this little publication after that saint. And I looked it up and I found it was St. Edward the Confessor. And I thought, wow, that's landed on my feet, hasn't it? It says St. Edward the Confessor, or quite often Step. It's been ever since. Now, is that good enough to sort of...
Well, that's very much the infancy of St. Edward's Press. What did you go on to publish after that? How did it grow from a private calendar?
I love the way you asked that question, because, of course, none of it was planned, or certainly wasn't planned by me. And what St. Edward's Press did for the next 13 years was produce this calendar for me, and a few people bought it. I'm very happy to provide my inadequate jottings, as it were. But maybe, should I better explain for anybody who wants to see? That's what it looks like inside. It's got the dates, the feasts, and the Missal. Can you see? I think you can. Those are the British saints, and those are other saints that I wanted to include. And so that was going on until 2006. And perhaps I ought to explain that, it sounds rather pompous this, but I am a published author, not only self-published. And my first book was published in 1988 on company law, a very dull subject, but it was, I think, quite a useful book. And various other books have been published ever since, mainly by Law Pack Publishing, who are a lovely firm of publishers. But I learnt as an accountant that the thing one should never do is charge one's clients by the hour. You should, all professionals should quote a fee up front, possibly be paid up front or paid over a period of time, but never charged by the hour, because nobody ever knows what the bill is going to be, and it's usually a nasty surprise for the client at the end of it. So I switched the whole of our practice to billing up front, and fees were never a problem. If there was a problem, I'd negotiate with the client, but nobody would hurt as a result of billing up front. And so I wrote this book called Life Without Timesheets, but I knew that Lawpack wouldn't be interested in publishing it. And I thought, well, hang on, I've got St. Edward's Press. Why don't we get Life Without Timesheets published by that? And so in 2006, out came St. Edward's Press's first proper book. And then shall I go on to the next one?
Please do.
Had to wait another 3 years for the next book. In other words, this was sort of, in a way, you could still say St Edward's Press still hasn't properly woken up or developed. But it's a long story, and I'll try to keep it very short. You probably haven't heard of Marta Andreasen, but Marta Andreasen was the EU's first chief accountant, who was a professionally qualified accountant. And in the early noughties, she was appointed, and she was asked to sign off the accounts by that had been prepared by her predecessor, and say, well, I better look at these accounts and make sure they're all right. And she found that there was a €200 million fraud in them. And she said, I'm not going to sign these accounts. So she was promptly suspended by the EU. The case was looked into, and she was found to be completely correct, but then sacked for disloyalty to the EU. And she tried to get herself reinstated, and unfair dismissal and all that sort of stuff. Didn't work at all. And for a reason I won't go into the details here, although it's in the book Brussels Laid Bare that St Edward's Press subsequently published. I got to know her, and I told her, I think you ought to get this book published. And so she went to much more grown-up publishers than St Edward's Press in November 2008. And I said, Marta, when you've got some copies, can you let me know, because I'd like to buy some. And she said, well, they'll be ready in February 2009. So I rang her up in 2009, and she said the publishers have pulled out. And so I said, well, I know how to get a book out. I'm not very good at marketing, but would you like me to do that for you, to publish a book? And so that was how St Edward's Press managed to publish, I think, one of the most important anti-EU books, Brussels Laid Bare, that ever was. So that gets us on to me having St Edward's Press having an author other than Hugh Williams.
And I believe another followed on the subject of the European Union.
There was, EU on, was it €387 million? That was a much bigger, thicker book. It didn't sell, sadly it didn't sell, because it was a beautifully written book. But yes, so I found myself, being approached by other authors, which was very kind. And then shall I carry on with what I was doing in the meantime?
Please do.
There isn't another question that I'm...
No, I think that if you, in this section, cover the publications that then followed as St Edward's Press grew and developed. So at the moment, from a very private origin, you then published your own work, Life Without Timesheets, and then St Edward's Press began to take on a sort of Eurosceptic, let's call it, dimension. And I think the sort of next step, as it were, in the process was bringing in something from your days of homeschooling.
Yes,
that is the very.
I'll do that first before. I'll do that first before the EU. Shall I say? That I haven't got a copy of the book on the windowsill here, so we'll talk about it. My job when teaching our children at home was to teach them history, and I had never been taught history properly. I don't suppose anybody's really taught history properly. I mean, one of the things that I never understood until I became a Catholic was what a dreadful, awful thing the Reformation was. I thought it was just an event in history, but there's far more to it than that. Anyway, I decided when teaching my children that I would keep the notes that I was giving them to keep on each subject. And as a result, I have a complete set of about 250 notes, 250 topics of the main events in British history. And I used to sort of refer to them a bit, but at least I'd got my, if I wanted to look up something like the South Sea Bubble, the detail was in about 5 bullet points or so. And then when teaching the next children at home, I thought, well, let's not repeat exactly that process. Let's go through the whole history of the world, because I'm a firm creationist. I'm a young earthist, and so I wrote that. Those were the notes, which I developed in a slightly different way. And I then thought, well, hang on, I've now got a lot of history detail here. I think it'd be quite a good idea to put it into book form. For me, put an index in, and what shall I call it? And I called it From to Us. And I happen to have got a couple of copies of From to Us here. It's a thick book. It's 600 pages now, and the very first section is the index, or over 10,000 lines in the index. Then you've got the next is the story so far, which is the history of the world. Then British history notes, and then every country's got a section of it, so a whole lot of appendices at the end, dealing with things like kings and queens, popes, rulers of Russia, etc., etc. I've probably said far too much about from out to west, but that came out about 10 years ago.
And is it worth mentioning that it got you into a little bit of trouble?
Yes, it did, because at that stage I was quite sort of senior in UKIP, and because I'd self-published it, I knew who had got copies, and it was jolly interesting reading the critics, the people who were very critical of it, who I knew had never had a copy. They just sort of jumped on the bandwagon of trashing me, and that's very good for the soul. Actually, it didn't put me off in any way. In fact, at that stage, probably the book was probably 300 pages, and it's now, as I say, 600 pages long, because I've been updating it ever since, and it's every year there's a new edition that comes out.
And also, UKIP Treasurer publishes non-PC history book.
Quite.
Generated some interest, did it not?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Probably got me a bad name, and that's not.
It's a great accolade today. Would you say some more about what St Edward's Press has published since?
You're being correct, because we now need to go back into UKIP mode, because I was canvassing for UKIP in St Budo in Plymouth, and a lady came to the door and she said, "Can you tell me what's wrong with the EU?" And I realised that what we were doing was asking people to vote UKIP. We weren't educating them as to why UKIP existed and why there was a need to leave the EU. And so I wrote a little pamphlet called 101 Reasons Why We Should Leave the EU. And over a period of time, that started to sell in lots. It's subsequently sold over 40,000 copies, which I'm pleased to be able to report, and was used extensively, particularly in the Midlands area and Birmingham, at the time of the referendum in 2016. So that was quite an important book. I like to think it was, but subsequently, and this is not necessarily going in chronological order, but in 2020, after we had supposedly left the EU, and I found that for all his faults, Nigel Farage really should have been given an award for what he did. And I wrote a sort of a book called Escape from Brussels, in which I paid tribute to all the people who I thought deserved a thank you and didn't get a thank you. And at the back of that book is a copy of 101 Reasons Why We Should Leave the EU, so that the story still exists. Now, I've got here, haven't I, here, a list of the books that I've got. So I'll just look through here, because numerous other people, delightful people, have come to me with their books. Michael Morley with English History has asked me to publish. I'm really pleased to have done that. Possibly, Dorothy Banks has come with
The Monology of
England, Our Lady's Diary.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And various other books as well. I sort of don't want to list them all, because that will sound like a sort of marketing exercise, I think, if I do. But the arrival of Martin Gwynne as a publisher was very interesting and a great, because Martin Gwynne, you probably know, often under the name of Neville Gwynne, has published Gwynne's Grammar, Gwynne's Latin, and Gwynne's Kings and Queens of England, I think it's called. I can see the book, we can't read the title from here. Not published by me, but his publishers, after telling the truth that he did in Kings and Queens, his publishers dropped him. And so Martin came to me and said, "Would you like to publish my book called Evolution or Creation?" And I thought, I'm delighted to do that. And so that came out in about 2020, I think, something like that. And then when that came, he wrote a book called Gwynne's William Shakespeare. And that was such an eye-opener to me, to realise, I'm going to say something that's probably very unpopular with everybody who's watching this, what a pernicious influence Shakespeare has been to wonderful English but dreadful morals, isn't there, throughout that. I think of King Lear or Titus Andronicus. I mean, what is going on with those things being lauded as important place? Anyway, Martin goes into a lot of that, and also who wrote Shakespeare. He goes into a lot of details and riveting stuff. So I'm very pleased to publish that. And then we had Gwyn on handwriting, a small little booklet. And most recently, no, not most recently, because two have followed very quickly, is Gwyn's Introduction to True Philosophy, which is a fabulous book. I've got a copy here, actually, funny enough. I haven't set these turns necessarily, but Gwyn's Introduction to True Philosophy, which is a real page turner. And maybe the first 100 pages are quite slow, but once you get into it, wow, I'm thrilled with that. And then recently we heard Gwyn on the writing of verse and poetry. I think that gets us up to date, but should I mention Out of Step, or
why not?
That in marketing, I've recently started to produce a little document called Out of Step, which comes out of sort of, I don't know how long, this is the second one in 6 months, so probably once every 6 months. I use it as marketing, and I use it to describe what's going on in the world, to advertise the books, and hope that people will get to know about St Edward's Press. Maybe, by the way, I'm suddenly thinking, should I mention about the Delling Pod? Would that be?
I think we'll save that for section 3. Where
section
we're going
3.
To start to
yep.
look more closely at what makes St Edward's Press a very different publishing firm to all the others. So I think that happily brings section 2.
The end of section 2. Great, thank you.